What's up, guys? Welcome to Metal Vibes, and today we are going to be talking about the iconic English death metal band, Bolt Thrower. This was a viewer request that I was very excited to see because I love Bolt Thrower. To me, they have such a heavy and melodic sound compared to other death metal bands, and they also had a really interesting twist late in their career arc that I'll be talking about later. The group started way back in 1986 with founding members Barry Thompson, who was the band's guitarist, and Gavin Ward, who originally started on bass but quickly shifted to guitars. Drummer Andy Whale would soon join, as would bassist Joe Bench, and with the addition of vocalist Carl Willits in 1988, the band would be set for their 1988 debut, In Battle There Is No Law. So, as this album shows, I think Bolt Thrower's roots are really much more in crust punk than death metal, even though they obviously played death metal for most of their career. As such, you have a really crust punk influenced sound on this album with fast, steady pounding drums that occasionally break into grooves or chugs, and I think that's best exemplified by the opening title track. This album overall is very raw, very primitive, kind of sloppy, but also endearing, and I do like it, even if it does sound almost nothing like what the band would become. Carl's roars on this album, for example, are just animalistic, and I really enjoy those. This album has some really maniacal energy to it as well that I really like. And there are some pretty cool songs here, too, like Challenge for Power, which has some neat groovy riffs. Then you also have tracks like Forgotten Existence and Psychological Warfare, which kind of sound like thrash metal mixed with some groovy crust punk for a really neat combination. That said, In Battle is pretty homogenous. I would definitely not call it a varied album. A lot of these songs have a pretty similar tempo, pretty similar feel, and while you have a track like Attack in the Aftermath, which has kind of a cool drum intro, I would say moments like that are very much the exception. I also don't like the way the closing track, Nuclear Annihilation, just kind of ends uneventfully. It really doesn't have the impact a closing track should have. This definitely isn't a bad album. I do like the energy of it, but it definitely sits in the shadow of what the band would later do. I'll put it at very good for now, actually, and see where that ends up, because I do think overall it is a very good album, even if I do think Bolt Thrower's later albums would definitely be an improvement. Alright, so following In Battle There Is No Law, Bolt Thrower would sign to Earache Records and release their second album, Realm of Chaos, in 1989. So some pretty notable changes with this album. Realm of Chaos definitely represents a big step forward into death metal, with more traditional death metal instrumentation and some deeper vocals from Carl. The production here is also quite a bit clearer than the debut, which isn't hard because the debut was so raw. But the production here, I would say, is still just as biting and has still just as much of an edge to it. Realm of Chaos is also much more melodic than the debut is, but it still retains that chaotic edge that In Battle There Is No Law had, especially when things get faster and those double bass drums just start throttling forward. I would say overall the songs are more memorable on Realm of Chaos as well. The first proper track, Eternal War, for example, was just an onslaught of great riffs. I love that kind of D-beat section that comes up in it. And it almost sounds like the style of the last album, but just kind of perfected and infused with a lot of death metal DNA. I also like the more slower tempos that start appearing on this album, especially on the track like All That Remains, which features trudging chords that soon break into big fat grooves and really hungry chugs. It's also impossible to talk about Realm of Chaos without mentioning the song World Eater, which I would say is not just Bolt Thrower's best song, but probably one of the top 5 death metal songs of all time. The main melodic riff of the song is just so catchy. I love that extended intro, and then once those crusty grooves start hitting, it's just an excellent experience. Interesting though, while this album is the highest rated on Metal Archives, I actually don't think it's Bolt Thrower's best. A lot of the songs here have pretty simple melodic riffs that all kind of sound similar to each other, and that definitely drags it down a bit for me. I would also say, compared to other Bolt Thrower albums, Realm of Chaos has a few less standout moments. It still works really well as an album, and I enjoy the energy of it, but there's just not as many memorable songs to me on it overall. In the context of the discography, I would say I find it kind of middle of the road. It's definitely not a middle of the road album, but in the context of Bolt Thrower's discography, it is. So I'll put it on the same tier as In Battle There Is No Law for now, but I definitely enjoy it more than In Battle There Is No Law. Alright, so following Realm of Chaos, Bolt Thrower would return in 1991 for the album War Master. Definitely a less rough production on this album, still powerful, but a bit easier to tell what's going on than the last two albums. I would say War Master kind of also feels like the first album that had that classic Bolt Thrower sound. I think you hear that right from the opening track, Unleashed Upon Mankind, which has these slower melodic riffs that soon break into these plowing rhythms that just sound like tanks rolling forward. Cenotaph is another track that uses some similar tricks and really stands out to me. I think those songs both show that the songwriting on War Master is a little more developed than the two prior albums, and I think the melodic riffs on War Master are a little more developed as well. While Realm of Chaos had some pretty simple melodic riffs that occasionally felt a little too simple and similar to each other, War Master features pretty cool melodic riffs in songs like What Dwells Within and Rebirth of Humanity that just feel more interesting to me. I also feel like War Master is Bolt Thrower's most varied album up to this point. The closing track, Afterlife, for example, has these mournful riffs and leads that I really like. They also go even further with the slower rhythms here on songs like Profane Creation and The Shreds of Sanity. But at the same time, you still have great uptempo songs like Final Revelation. I would say War Master kind of continues the development from the last album, but also retains the catchy grooves from the debut, making it what I would say kind of a best of both worlds. It's definitely better to me than Realm of Chaos. I don't think it's quite in the top tier of Bolt Thrower albums, but it is a very, very good album. In fact, it's a great album and one of my personal favorites, so I would put it in the great tier for now. Alright, so following War Master, Bolt Thrower would return in 1992 for the album The Fourth Crusade. Again, production continues to improve. This has a more clear and more powerful sound without sounding overly polished. I would say the biggest change with The Fourth Crusade, however, is that the band continued capitalizing on those slower rhythms, and that's especially noticeable on the opening title track. This is a slower track that's one of the band's best known songs and features a main riff that is just iconic. I will say even the faster moments on The Fourth Crusade also just feel a little bit more controlled. Even on War Master, it still felt very maniacal when the band would break into faster tempos, but here it just feels a little more measured. Like, instead of a chaotic war type feeling, it just feels like a big war machine just moving forward. The Fourth Crusade, I would also say, is the most melodic Bolt Thrower album, possibly in their discography, but definitely up to this point. Songs like Icon and Where Next to Conquer stand out to me with these really diving melodic riffs. I also like the track Ritual, which has this really fast melodic riff that's really enjoyable. I will say, though, I don't necessarily always love the melodic riffs on this album. Some of them start to sound kind of similar to each other, and a lot of times songs will just kind of play the melodic riffs and let them stand on their own rather than doing anything interesting with them. The one exception to that is the track Celestial Sanctuary, which uses a melodic riff to kind of conjure a catchy chorus, and I wish more songs here did things like that. Generally speaking, too, I think with The Fourth Crusade, some of the songs, especially in the middle of the album, sort of have a similar feel, and that's definitely not helped by the fact that this album is the longest Bolt Thrower album at 53 minutes in length. It's still a fantastic death metal album, but I think I prefer the manic energy of War Master just a little more, and I think with those criticisms, I can't rank it above War Master, although I do think it is a better album than the first two. Alright, so following The Fourth Crusade, Bolt Thrower would return in 1994 with the album For Victory. This, to me, is another iconic release. It kind of takes the more melodic approach of The Fourth Crusade, mixes it with the faster approach of War Master, and just shoots out an outstanding album that's a very tightly written 40-minute package and is, I think, one of the best albums in the band's catalog. I think I saw in an interview that they actually had less time to polish the songs in this album, or at least that was one member's perspective. But that's kind of surprising to hear because I think the songs on this album are some of the best the band have written. Remembrance, which is the first proper track, stands out to me with these really catchy melodic riffs, kind of similar to the melodic ideas from The Fourth Crusade, but sped up. When Glory Beckons also sounds like a more energized version of The Fourth Crusade. Then you have the title track, For Victory, which kind of has a slower opening before breaking into these really powerful chords that I just like. There's also some great solos on this song, and I would say great solos throughout this album. I think with For Victory, you just have riffs that have a lot of attitude and just jump out, especially on songs like Forever Fallen, which just has this twirling melodic riff that I love. Silent Demise is a little bit more repetitive, but again, its main riff is strong enough that that really doesn't hurt the song that much. I think the biggest issue with this album is that Carl just sounds a little weathered here. For some reason, his growl just doesn't sound quite as powerful, and at times it sounds like he's kind of straining a bit, especially on the closing track, Armageddon Bound. Other than that, though, that's pretty much the only quibble I have with For Victory. I think this is an outstanding album that kind of builds on the best elements of the two prior albums. This goes in the top tier of the band's discography to me. So after a consistent lineup with the first 5 albums, drummer Andy Whale would leave after For Victory, causing drummer Martin Kearns to fill his place. Carl Willits would also leave the band at this time, causing the band to tour with other vocalists, including Martin Van Drunen of Asphyx fame. But eventually, Bolt Thrower would return in 1998 for their Metal Blade Records debut, Mercenary. So Carl would actually return to do vocals for this album, which was pretty cool, but drummer Alex Thomas would appear instead of Martin Kearns, as Martin left the band just prior to this album's recording. In terms of Mercenary overall, it's definitely one of Bolt Thrower's less highly regarded albums, I would say, and I definitely agree with that to some extent. I think the opening track, Zeroed, kind of shows why. This track just sort of feels like Bolt Thrower by numbers. You know, we've heard these melodic guitars alternated with the rolling rhythms before, and it just doesn't sound particularly fresh here. The song does pick up a bit in its second half, but it's also almost 6 minutes long overall, which I think is a little too long, and that complaint really does extend to some other tracks on this album as well. The average track length on this album is right around 5 minutes, and I don't think a lot of these tracks necessarily needed to be that long. Overall, the quality of the songs probably is just a little bit lower than a lot of the prior albums, but there are some things I do really enjoy about Mercenary, and it's definitely not a bad release. The production, I think, is a lot fuller than their prior albums, with some really rich sounding guitars. I think Carl sounds great here. He's got some real attitude to his vocals, even if he doesn't sound maybe as powerful as some of the earlier albums. There's also some really standout songs here, especially Powder Burns, which has this really resonant and powerful riff. It's honestly probably one of the best riffs in the band's career. No Guts, No Glory is super catchy, and it's probably one of the band's best groovy songs up to this point. Then you have Return from Chaos, which kind of has these rapid chords that I really like. The other thing I like about Mercenary is I feel like there's slightly less reliance on the melodic riffs here, and while I like the band's more melodic ideas, on the two prior albums, it feels like they were starting to get a little overdone, and the melodies were starting to sound a little similar to each other, so I'm glad that this album kind of stepped back from that a little bit. That said, I definitely don't think Mercenary is as strong as the three prior albums. It's pretty much on par to me with In Battle There Is No Law and Realm of Chaos, but I think Realm of Chaos just beats it out because it has a little more energy, and it also has World Eater, which is hard to beat. Alright, so following Mercenary, drummer Martin Kearns would rejoin the band, and the group would then release their second Metal Blade Records album, Honor, Valor, Pride, in 2001. So Carl left the band following Mercenary, so Dave Ingram did vocals for this album instead of Carl. Dave's probably most famous for his work in Benediction, and while he's certainly a legendary death metal vocalist, I really don't like his performance here that much, to be honest. He sounds strained and weak, kind of like Carl's weaker moments on For Victory. And even aside from the vocals, I would say I'm kind of not a huge fan of this album as a whole. My thoughts on this record are kind of similar to Mercenary in that it feels like the band just weren't producing material that was engaging as their prior material. The song Honor, for example, has one of those melodic riffs that kind of sounds similar to what the band were doing on the Fourth Crusade, but it just ends up feeling pretty repetitive and is not a very interesting song to me. That said, Bolt Thrower have never released a bad album, and there certainly aren't some good cuts here. I like the opening track, Contact Wait Out, which has this opening riff consisting of these sustained notes that I just love. I also love the chorus of this song with these really blunt riffs, and then Dave just going, "Await the call." The song Inside the Wire feels like it has tighter and groovier rhythms than the band has ever had, and I actually think that's largely attributed to Martin Kearns' performance. I think he's probably the best drummer the band ever had, and he definitely shines on this album. Suspect Hostile is also a pretty cool track, but I will say with some of the later songs in this album, it feels like maybe a cool riff crops up now and then, but the song as a whole just really doesn't do a whole lot for me. So with that, I would probably have to say, while Honor, Valor, Pride is still a solid death metal album, I'd pretty much rather listen to any other Bolt Thrower album than this, including In Battle There Is No Law. So because of that, I'm going to have to put it at the bottom of their discography. It's still a pretty good album, but not quite as good as their other albums. And just to separate things a little bit, I'm going to move In Battle There Is No Law down to the still pretty good tier, because in retrospect, I don't think it's quite as good as Mercenary and Realm of Chaos, and probably shouldn't be on the same tier as them. So Dave Ingram would leave the band following Honor, Valor, Pride due to personal and health problems, leading Carl Willits to rejoin the band in 2004 for the group's final album, 2005's Those Once Loyal. So a lot of bands have this trajectory in their career where they have a couple early albums that are excellent and really make them legendary, and Then they kind of release some mediocre albums, and then maybe they'll come back with a really cool comeback album that people enjoy, but still sits in the shadow of the band's early albums. With Those Once Loyal, however, I think Bolt Thrower kind of took that cliche and basically pummeled it to dust. To me, while Bolt Thrower's prior albums were all at least really good, Those Once Loyal pretty much blows away everything else in their catalog in my book. With this album, it's like they took the more melodic elements, the more groovy elements, and the more straightforward death metal elements, and just kind of combined them together in a way that was as catchy and cohesive as possible, and yet still didn't lose an ounce of their heaviness or their attitude. And not only does Those Once Loyal work really well as an album, the songs here are just outstanding. The opening track, At First Light, just breaks in with this amazing melody that's cut off by Carl's shout of the track title, and then this rolling rhythm just comes in. It's such an excellent way to kick the album off. The Kill Chain has probably the best groovy riff the band has ever written, and probably one of the best groovy death metal riffs ever. God, that song is so good. And I think this track also shows that despite the fact that Bolt Thrower were catchier with this album, they didn't feel repetitive or formulaic. They still managed to keep things interesting, because the main riff of this song just slightly morphs over the song's runtime and stays interesting throughout. In terms of other tracks, Granite Wall and Anti-Tank are both just groovy monsters. Anti-Tank is a particularly great song with these lyrics and vocal lines that are just so catchy. Every time I hear this song, I just want to growl along with it. Even the deeper cuts here, like Last Stand of Humanity, are still worthy of any death metal playlist. I have to say, though, the best song here is definitely the closing track, When Cannons Fade, which just has an onslaught of amazing riffs, from groovy riffs to melodic riffs to more mournful ideas. It's so good. And the final simple melodic riff that closes this song out is just absolute bliss. The production here is pretty much perfect, especially that bass guitar. The solos here are awesome. Really, everything about this album is just fantastic. This was the first Bolt Thrower album I heard, and it made it kind of hard to get into their other albums because of just how much I loved Those Once Loyal. I would say this is not only one of my favorite death metal albums ever, it's easily one of my top 25 favorite albums of all time, and easily the best thing in the band's discography to me. In an already strong discography, this is the strongest. An absolutely essential listen for any fan of extreme metal in my book. Sadly, however, Those Once Loyal will be the last Bolt Thrower album, as the band decided to scrap the recording of their follow-up because they felt it was not as strong as Those Once Loyal. Unfortunately, drummer Martin Kearns would pass away in 2015, leading the band to break up the following year, meaning Bolt Thrower is no longer active, and I can't imagine we'll ever get another album from them. That said, though, what a legacy they've left behind. You still hear their influence on death metal today, and the 8 albums they did produce make for such a great discography. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know in the comments what you think of Bolt Thrower. Let me know what you think of my rankings. And as always, if you like this video, please subscribe, please drop me a like. And if you want to see me talk about more death metal, check out this video over here, where I rank the albums of the Florida death metal band Morbid Angel. But that's all for now. As always, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next time. Stay heavy.